Juan. Welcome back to the second action lab this afternoon. This is effective responses to executive overreach, the role of civil society. And we are excited to have this second interactive session, which my colleague Helena will explain in a few minutes what the dynamics is. We are privileged to have a fantastic lineup of speakers, friends, colleagues, activists, really interesting people, and we would have a chance to extract some lessons and actions, ideally, from this panel. I am happy to share this, the chairing of this panel with Helena Hofbauer Balmori. She is at the Ford Foundation. And one thing that has not been said is that you were the founding member of Fundar, which is one of the most prestigious civil society organizations in Mexico, looking after many types of civil society engagement. Then we have Juan Sebastián Chamorro, good friend, former candidate for the presidency in Nicaragua, and former political prisoner as a result of that. We have, you have Nika Kovac in your program originally. She has not been able to come to this conference. And fortunately, we have John Koshy accompanying us this afternoon. We also have Eva Kulik-Bielinska from the Stefan Batory Foundation in Poland. And finally, Miguel Loureiro from the Institute of Development Studies in the United Kingdom. So I'll turn over to Helena so she can explain what the dynamic will be.
Thank you. And I apologize for appearing so quickly in front of all of you. But please play with us. This is an experiment, and we really want it to become interesting. So this action lab is not going to be your panel of inputs. We actually want to have a very lively conversation. So if you start seeing us like throwing things around, you can intervene. And we want that lively conversation to open up to you. So we will privilege the opportunity of getting your input into our conversation. And hopefully, it will work as we intend. There will be again a Menti. If we can briefly put it up so that everybody can open it again with the QR code. It seems that I cannot turn over there because my microphone will start becoming sketchy. So we will have a first question and we'll engage amongst all of us in that question. From the second question on, you will have a Menti question appear on the screen. And you can answer that Menti question as soon as you see it appear, or listen a little bit to the conversation and then go in and answer it. We will, after having a brief discussion here among panelists or action labists about the question, we will then turn to you. So we will also appreciate if there are microphones available for people to come in. We don't want you to come in and tell us, in compared theory, this and this would happen regarding this. No, we want you to come in with action points. Please come in with examples of strategies, of actions, of whatever you think is relevant for what is being discussed. And let's see how that works. If it doesn't work, we will come up with something else the next time. But let us try, and please engage with us, because that is the purpose of this session. So let me start. And Eva, this first question is for you. And remember,
3 minutes.
No, 3 minutes. 1 minute, precise, very quick answers. In your experience, what is one key lesson you have learned about the role that civil society can play to contain anti-democratic government actions?
You cannot be only reactive, you have to be proactive, and you have to offer some solutions that can be implemented even at the moment when democracy is in danger. And you have to give people sense of agency, that they can change things even now. So not only react, but be proactive. And that's what we've been doing. And then you come with your kind of agenda for what can be changed, and you offer it as a common thing for all the political parties who cannot agree upon anything because they fight among one another. So when it comes from an objective, non-partisan actor as a civil society, this is a moment when they can agree because it's not their platform, it's our platform. So that's the lesson we learned.
That is super good. And can we have reactions to what Eva said?
I can jump in
Yeah.
over there. I think in addition to what Eva is saying, and I fully agree with that, is that the civil society also plays this sort of bellwether agent to kind of first highlight that there is some kind of negative democratic deconsolidation happening. I think the problem with democratic decline these days is it's not overnight. It's sudden, it's incremental, it's slow, it's conscious, it's strategic, and it's case of like incrementally chipping away at sort of democratic foundations through laws and so on. And I think civil society is literally the only agent that has that kind of eye and pulse over there, because with everyone else, whether it's politicians or the media and so on, their attention and kind of like priorities are so scattered that it really requires an agent that is on the ground that can kind of give you that kind of input that democracy is actually in decline at this point. Yeah.
So proactivity, engaging, raising the alarm,
Yeah.
putting the spotlight. What else? Miguel, Juan.
But not only that, I think you have to think what's going to be a day after. So you have to, again, be prepared and work on the program or work on the ideas, on the solutions that you can offer on the election day, that you have the program and agenda that it's already agreed upon with main actors, and that there is something to be done the moment they take power, not to think what to do then.
Which is a little bit this idea that it's also not enough to just protest. You have to know what it is that you want, not only what you don't want, what you want to stop, but what is it that you want to see instead of that. Miguel, do you want
I was just going to say, you can't do it alone as well. I mean, and a lot of different authors mentioned, presenters yesterday and today is you engage inside, outside. You need to go inside. I'm trying to remember, I think it was O'Donnell and Schmidt who talked about the soft liners. You got your hard liners, but there are also soft liners. You have to go and find them. Usually tend to be like the soft ministries of health, education. You're trying to see people that are inside that are saying, well, you know, this is not a democracy, but soon will be a democracy. And you try to engage with them as well, with the political elites as well.
Mm-hmm. And we certainly talked about a lot of different mechanisms, influencing mechanisms through which civil society can be effective counterparts. Let's turn to you, John, and can you reflect a little bit what your experience has been looking at protest and civil manifestations to defend democracy from being intervened?
Okay, so I think there's an obvious level in which, you know, a protest or a public mobilization is essentially saying that, you know, the status quo that we have today is not okay and that we need to kind of turn the table over and so on. And that's at a very basic level what a successful protest or mobilization does. But I think if you look back again, you know, in India, we've had a few large, India is where I'm from. I spent 7 years working over there before moving to Democracy Hub, where we work on problems relating to democracy at a more global level. What we have seen with the successful mobilizations and so on is that in a way, good movements, protests, large mobilizations to a certain extent create a certain moral dilemma when it comes to the executive. You know, how do they respond to a public mobilization and so on? One of our largest mobilizations in the last few years was these anti-Citizenship Amendment Act protests that took place across India. If you haven't followed this, I would really encourage, because it really has been one of the few rays of hope in India's otherwise, let's say, not very happy democratic sort of history in recent times. So the anti-CAA protests, you know, took place across the country, but its core center to a certain extent was at this location called Shaheen Bagh. And you had, it was a legislation that primarily targeted or was seen to be discriminatory against India's Muslims, who form the largest minority in India. And you had these 24/7 sit-down protests organized primarily by women, of Muslim women across age groups, across class groups, and so on. It was a protest that wasn't allowed to be politicized. No politicians were allowed to come and kind of co-opt it. Civil society was also not allowed to formally co-opt it, and so on. But look, we can go into the details of that mobilization later, but I think what the anti-CAA protest did to a certain extent is that you had these women protesting peacefully, sitting down in the center of New Delhi, India's capital. And any kind of action that the government tried to do to kind of clamp down on the protests made them look insecure. It kind of exposed the power within power. It showed that, for example, a just government was not really just. A strong government was not really strong. A government that claims to be for women is actually not actually for women because they're trying to come down on these things. So I think successful mobilizations to a certain extent create that moral dilemma. Like any action that the executive then tries to do, puts them in a position of weakness. So it's kind of almost like a bait that you give to the executive.
And you've certainly made reference to this long-standing question of whether civil society to be more effective and for protests to be more effective, do they need to connect with political parties? And is there a natural linkage, or is the danger of being co-opted? So, where would you draw the line, and the conditions under which a political party can be instrumental to advance the work of civil society or not?
Yeah, I was going to say that I was struck with definitely the mobilization is a very important element, as we can see here in the survey. But I was struck by, I think, what Suzanne was talking about the Serbia case, right? With protests all over the place. But there was no political coordination with political parties. And I think that's a fundamental action. This is an action lab. So it's a fundamental thing that to do protest, not by itself, but also as a political project with political allies and try to bring politicians into the formula. So I really appreciate that example because it illustrates the importance. There's so many movements that have been failed because didn't have that political element.
If I may,
tell us a little bit.
In the Polish case, it was a little bit different, I would say, because there was so little trust in the political opposition and enormous trust in civil society. 65% of citizens believe that civil society is doing good. Only 34% believe that it's a government that is doing good. So all the protests that were there, judiciary, but then the protest of women, general Poland women's strike, that was taking place in 450 localities in Poland on the same day, 90% of them in the towns below 50,000. So it was the biggest protest in the history of Poland. There was no political moment for change. They were protesting against this law on abortion that was being made so strict that even Vatican has more liberal one. And this was a pretext. It was not so much about the abortion. It was about women's rights. It was like total infringement of your very intimate and personal rights. So it was not the women who were protesting, but mainly women. And it was also, I would say, a link to the protests against the takeover of the Constitutional Tribunal, because it makes the link. What it means when the Constitutional Tribunal is taken over. How this little bit abstract court for most of the ordinary people, because they do not go to the Constitutional Court at all. It's about, making sure that the constitutions are violated and the rights written in constitutions are not violated. And suddenly, this was like a visible element showing how this links to your personal rights. And what was important in all these protests that were taking place in Poland, for months and even for years, it was no logo protest. The idea was on the podium, who's speaking, the civil society representatives, and they invite the politicians to their roster, on their agenda. And the same was with certain propositions that were being made by the civil society. This was their propositions, and they offered it to the political parties to endorse. And here I would say you're right, because, we wouldn't be able to make the end of this authoritarian regime if not the political parties. And we did cooperate with them, but in a way that we will not compromise ourselves as those who are working on their agenda, because that's how the Law and Justice Party was working with the civil society that they created from the top down.
Miguel?
So I was just thinking of Bangladesh, I mean, because it's just now. And what you have is, so the protest started with kids almost. A few years ago, they were in the streets protesting against traffic and being run and hit by cars and bad traffic. And it got clamped down. And years later, these kids are now university students, and they're complaining about the quota system, that it goes to a particular party, which is in rule, sorry. And they come out to the streets, and initially it's just the kids. And it's well, university students, boys and girls, a lot of girls. And because of the way that the government, Sheikh Hasina's government, clamps down and brings in the security forces and they start killing them, is when there's this moment where the parents come out as well. And suddenly you get this massive mobilization. Political parties to a certain extent as well. There's this massive mobilization. And actually one of the interesting turning points is when the young officers in the army are saying, we're done, we're not going to kill our own people. And it's, I mean, I'm biased, I'm Portuguese. Our revolution was a military coup, which is very rare to bring in, well, it was to bring in the freedomists, also to make sure that they were not being killed in the former colonies, in the independence wars. But it's very interesting as well that it kind of snowballed, and I think those were the two key moments, was the parents coming out and not being afraid and being killed, and the young officers. So there's a lot of, I'm being biased here with the youth, but there's a lot of young officers as well saying, no, these are not our people. We have to stop.
So there are a series of elements that have been mentioned, but let us hear a little bit from you. What do you think is needed to make a protest useful, to make a protest actually impactful? I mean, there is a big majority thinking that protests and public mobilization is key to defend democracy. What have you seen work or not work? I mean, we can also talk about what doesn't work. There was a hand by a gentleman in the back.
Great, thank you. Jeff Wheeler, Georgetown University. Mobilizing civil society sometimes is like herding cats, right? You have a lot of different groups. They have different agendas. They feel very strongly about it. So one of the hard parts is, how do you find common agreement and stick to your message? I've been with these mobilized groups where they don't stick to their message. Their organization has a very specific passion. They agree with some of the democracy elements, but maybe that's not their core issue. So the tricky part is, how do we agree on what the message is? How do we stick to that message? And then how do we identify what the results are? There's a lot of arguments about what the results are that we're trying to achieve. How concrete are they? So the U.S. is the worst, I think, in terms of trying to herd cats and getting different civil society agreements on the results. So I'm curious, too, in identifying that problem, what solutions have been out there?
We always think that our countries are the worst, definitely. Let's hear over here.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for all of your remarks. My name is Michael Angeloni. I'm with Protect Democracy. I would just be curious, going back to the example of the ongoing mobilization in Serbia, where there's been a concerted effort among civil society to detangle itself from the political opposition and really keep those two things separate, and to what effect we're not exactly sure yet, since it's happening in real time. But thinking about the successful Polish mobilizations in recent years, at what point did civil society decide to invite political parties and politicians into their mobilization? Because that seems to me to be a really important ingredient in this recipe.
Remember that this is not to ask questions. We're opening the microphone to get your input on what works or what are challenges in the cases that we're mentioning. Obviously, involving politicians is something that is as important as it is challenging.
That's right.
So is there another input? Yes.
Susan.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Thank you very much. So I think this is all very, very much to the core of the issue, a collaboration between politicians or politics, the political arena, and civil society, and it's very neuralgic, if I can say so, all the time, everywhere in the world. Because this is key, but many of you already mentioned that oftentimes civil society actors are really distancing themselves because they are more popular than politicians who are. So it's very, very relevant issue. So I think Eva's example is definitely something important. What maybe in addition to that the whole thing is very contextual. So the fact that you explain how the women mobilization, younger women specifically, was linked to a constitutional issue, which was a specificity of the Polish case, this is really unique, right? So what made it possible to happen? Some kind of strategic thinking. And I think this is what I often miss from civil society and social organization. It's a political thinking, basically. So, and how do we define strategic thinking? It is actually a process. It's not that I have a strategy and then I go on and implement it, but this is a constant ability and readiness to analyze and think about how to use the resources for a goal. And this is something I think very difficult for many civil society organizations to run, because this requires a political thinking, which is typical for politicians. But this is actually very necessary when you are in a repressive environment. And then the other thing is which is contextual, is that you need to have some kind of perspective. So if you do not have perspective, and this is one of the difference between Poland and Hungary, when you have a viable opposition, a reasonable, strong opposition, then it's easier to do massive mobilization. When if there is a big and strong regime and says there's no reason to do anything because you won't get anywhere, then it requires more effort.
So let's make sure that we keep all interventions short, because we want to continue with the conversation. There is one more hand over here, or no, over there.
Yes, thank you. Koskande Abdushafi, I'm with Freedom House. Just on the civic mobilization, I think one of the things that are worked is the ability of the transforming the digitally formed associations and movements into the physical, meaning that the youth group particularly are very good in creating causes online, and they can actually transform those successfully into a physical alliance, for instance, what happened in Kenya for the economic things, but also in Sudan. And in Bangladesh, where the public safety thing become a voice, will mobilize moms and women and youth and come back to the street. I think one of the biggest challenge is that, and this is one that we did research on civil mobilizations a few years ago, that the entrenched political opposition parties are not inclusive enough with the youth voices. And always when it comes to the movement building, this comes to youth brought their agenda into the political party houses, especially oppositions. They reformulate those and exclude those groups that actually hinders the real change to happen. And I think it's like how those agendas being reconfigured or reformulated within these institutions that are not flexible enough to include this grassroots, genuine, well-represented into those institutions is the biggest question of failures of the civil mobilization. Over.
Thank you. Let me give you 1 minute each to react to what you have been hearing, but be concise. I'm sorry, I'm being a monster, I know.
So I will start. For me, civic mobilization is not only protests. Civic mobilization, this is something that we have been doing for 8 years in Poland to sustain the movement, the resistance, but also the idea how to move forward and how to convince people that we are not doing what the opposition is doing, that basically criticizing peace, saying that they are bad and not offering any new ideas what to do. So what we were doing, and this was, not agreeing with the whole civil society, but with certain part of civil society organizations for whom certain policy was very natural because they were working in this area, and if they offer some recommendations and propositions, they were very viable because they know what they are talking about. So there were several draft bills that were being prepared by the civil society organizations, and one very important one was prepared by the constitutional lawyers that were working with the Batory Foundation as their experts. And they were working on this bill on constitutional tribunal reform for 3 years. It was not written by one person, it was written by the whole group of people. Then we made it like a model way to consult the bill in order to gain popularity and support from different circles. First, we gave them for a review for the constitutional tribunal experts, then academia, then civil society organizations working on human rights and rule of law, then all these protest social movements that were engaged in supporting the independence of judiciary. Then we made it open for the consultations. And only then, after taking on board all these elements, we started to promote it in a way that people understand what this bill is about, because not all of them are lawyers to understand. So it's a whole series of events, meetings in the universities, in the Congress of Judiciary Professions, in the civil society organizations meetings, and only then we proposed it to the opposition in the parliament. And we were having conversation with them one by one, because the problem in the Polish opposition is it's stronger than in Hungary, but it's so much divided. And if somebody is coming up with some idea, the other doesn't agree because he's afraid that he will be devoured by this one and it will lose its constituency. So only after talking with them bilaterally, we put them together and had the hearing in the Senate, which at that time was not. Was much more pluralistic and had not the majority of Law and Justice Party. And this bill, when the moment came, so this was a political moment when the parliamentary elections were won by the democratic opposition, was proposed as a civic bill supported by all then democratic coalition parties in the parliament, and was adopted. And now it's waiting for the new president to sign it.
Miguel, I saw you scribbling.
Oh, no, I was just thinking of, picking up from the point from the colleague from Freedom House, I think it's something worth asking, which is how democratic are your democratic institutions? How democratic are your political parties? How do they elect leaders? How democratic are civil society organizations? A lot of the time it's a one-man show. I'm not pointing at you, sorry. But it's quite often is that, right? Or sometimes it's a couple show. But I think it's worth kind of picking on the different elements of your regime and see how democratic they are.
John?
I mean, I would agree on that as well. I think this question of linking up between civil society and political stakeholders and so on is, of course, very context-based, but it also depends on the status of the political opposition, what kind of credibility they have, who's spearheading that opposition, what is the kind of public trust and kind of public responsiveness in this individual's ability to kind of drag the opposition combined with civil society. In our case in India, we didn't kind of have that. We have, of course, multiple opposition parties per se, but the principal opposition party in India was still, at least very recently, some could argue still is, was going through a period of leadership crisis and so on. So there wasn't that kind of, automatic link up. The other point that I think is worth mentioning is that often, like sometimes movements, I love the herding of cats example because it's a great analogy. I think sometimes public mobilizations fail because they expect a certain hyper alignment on method, on positions, on what we have 10 agenda issues. We have to accept only people who will agree to all 10 agenda issues. And in reality, life doesn't work like that. The politicians want one thing, the civil society folks want another thing. Someone wants political power, someone wants to save the constitution. This kind of hyper-alignment, I think, really kills, any kind of concrete public mobilization. It's easier when you frame it around short, broad strategic goals and then focus on the nitty-gritties of details later on.
Certainly one question, I think, is that so far the conversation is around how does civil society mobilize, organize in the context of democratic rules and regulations. But when the space for democracy begins to tighten up and you start into a more overt authoritarian regime, then the dynamic of the game will change. So maybe you can quickly reflect on that. I'm thinking of you, Juan, in terms of how does this dynamic of civil society organization changes when you no longer are talking to a democratic regime.
Well,
just a moment, if we can shift to the next Menti so that our audience reacts to that, please.
Yes, I think there's a whole discussion in the last few days, 2 days, about coordination that I think is very relevant. I'm coming from a country that the regime actually eliminated the whole civil society ecosystem. More than 6,000 NGOs eliminated, 27 universities. And the interesting thing is that the Ortega regime eliminated NGOs from the different ideological spectrum, from the Red Cross, charities, evangelical, Catholic, conservative, liberal organizations. And there's a general agreement among the NGO, the civil society community, that there is a bigger problem. Thinking about one of the questions regarding how do you, in the plurality, can focus on the specific actions. And so I think it's when you have a system where you're under attack that you put things into perspective and you start to realize that, yes, there are differences, but there are higher levels of priorities that you have to maintain. And then it is necessary to actions. For example, organizations with different perspectives from different backgrounds to agree on disagreements and leave those disagreements aside for the moment in the purpose of obtaining the main objective, or non-aggression agreements, for example. That's another action that you can have in the phase. And this doesn't apply necessarily addressed to situations like Nicaragua. It can apply to a more general context. You don't have to have a dictator like in Nicaragua. I think the practices can be applied to, democratic backsliding situations as well.
Mm-hmm. Does somebody want to add to that? Contest it?
No, we were lucky. We were lucky under communism. We were the most merry country in the whole communist camp. And similarly, I would say with these authoritarian tendencies, they were quite mild. Nobody was threatened to go to prison. Nobody was arrested. Nobody was so much harassed in the terms of the organizations did function. The idea of eliminate their role and influence was basically to put them on the starvation diet. So no grants from the public administration, ostracism and, smear campaigns, trying to make them, scapegoats or this or that. But this, maybe because of Polish kind of characteristics and nature, it worked to our benefit. I mean, Batory Foundation, for example, during these years, raised so much money as never before because it was attacked, because it was standing on these values that for some people were important and was attacked by the Law and Justice Party, as this organization that is defending the EU values. And also with our organization, I mean, we were also lucky that just before peace took power, we managed to change the law on fundraising. And then, a lot of organizations that were fighting for democracy were getting from crowdfunding enough money to, I would not support them whole kind of work, but more important work. So it was like voting by donation, that you support the democratic agenda and you are against the encroachment on democracy and violation of rule of law.
So you have already mentioned different actors that have to be involved in holding this democratic backsliding. I'm happy to see that most of us agree that civil society is not enough. Does somebody want to give us examples of other actors that are needed because we are so used to thinking in silos?
Asking us or them?
one here.
Angeli.
Hi.
And you can come.
I guess what I wanted to say before that I think that links to this one on the successful of movements and also actors, I think one thing that didn't come up yet was media and freedom of expression, right? I think that is usually movements and protests are composed of minorities for several reasons, for the cost of joining a protest and anything else. And I think that when you broadcast what's going on, not only this makes the movement stronger, but it also increases the cost of government to oppress and suppress movements, right? It changes the calculation. And I think that there's a very important then role in the media. And when you don't have democratic regimes, when you don't have domestic free media, then I think the international media is very important to complement this role.
Here is a hand. Yes, please come in. While the microphone.
I was just going to pick on that because of your starvation diet. In a lot of countries, legacy media depends on governments, right? Because, you've got your ads and everything. And you notice that in a lot of countries, one of the tactics of controlling the media is saying, well, we're not going to put our ads in your newspaper. So, yeah, it's...
So, hi. Eric Manton, USAID. International actors are very important. So whether they're foreign officials or people who work for international organizations, one of the tactics that has worked in the past is international solidarity. When Max van der Stoel, as the Dutch foreign minister, went in 1977 to meet the leaders of Charter 77, that had a massive impact and protected them very much. However, I'm not sure if that still is valid anymore because autocrats are denying the universality of human rights and they're denying accountability mechanisms, and there is no shame anymore, as the current president has demonstrated very well. So international solidarity has been an extremely strong ingredient, but can it be in the future as well?
Yeah.
My name is S.Y. Qureshi. I'm from India. We feel civil society is too romanticized, whereas in a polarized society, it can become very destructive. They are jingoist. They force the government into wars, into genocide and everything. Therefore, we need to understand that. At the same time, many in the civil society-led movements have been successful, and I'm glad my friend from India mentioned about the Shaheen Bagh protest, all by women, where just a few women sat on the street in a dharna, in a sit down, and very soon it became 150,000 people. It went on for 101 days. The government was totally rattled. And COVID came to their rescue. Because of COVID, regulations, restrictions were imposed, and the thing was disbanded. Since this is an academic community, I don't know if any the university has done a case study of this all-women agitation. It deserves to be a case study. That's one. And I would end on one translation of an Urdu poetry verse, which explains the whole thing and which also explains the Shaheen Bagh. And this is how it goes, the translation. I started alone towards my destination, and then people kept on joining me, and it became a caravan. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So let's hear a little bit from you. Any reaction to this lack of international actors as a useful tool currently, and how can we substitute for that? We're running out of tools in our toolbox, or the toolbox is not useful for this situation.
I just want to respond to two of the comments that were said over here. One is completely agree on the point about media, especially new media, international media, and so on. What we have seen is also, some of the large mobilizations in India, I say some because there aren't too many, also have focus on this question a lot, because throughout the regime is trying to smear them, saying that, these are anti-nationals, these are kind of like people who don't have the country's best interests and so on, and they're using all sorts of disinformation tactics to kind of discredit the movement. Now, what some of these, and specifically there's a movement that is referred to as a farmers' protest 2020 to 2021, and it's still going on right now, is that they came up with their own kind of in-house media, which is like, we will cover the protests on our own. So one part of it is, of course, mobilization. The other part is, of course, helping us to try to control that narrative, because that is so essential for them to kind of succeed in this. On the international solidarity point, I also agree, but I think that depending on the context, it can be a double-edged sword to a certain extent. That international support can then be used against the agent or that particular person on the ground by saying that this person is you guys have all heard this narrative. This person is an agent of that funder, or this person is an agent of that colonial power, and so on. And this kind of interference in our national sovereignty. International solidarity is essential. I think it's good, but it has to be kind of calibrated in a calculated manner so that it doesn't actually do more damage than help with the situation.
On that line, I think international community can only help to solve the problems, but at the end of the day, are nationals the ones responsible for changing the situation in our countries. Now, precisely because in some regimes, elements have been lost, like justice, for example, or freedom of expression, is that you actually have to see outside the things that are being denied at home. Just to give you an example, thinking about another action, justice, international justice. Myself, as a former political prisoner, I have a petition into the Inter-American Court of Human Rights because I cannot rely on the system, legal system in my country. So those are tools, and then you got the International Court of Justice, you have the ICC, and you have all these elements that are extremely important to build another element that Justice Barroso mentioned yesterday, and that is the construction of the truth, the element of a narrative that counterbalance the lies of these autocrats. So when you bring an expert that has no interest in the local conflict and investigates the violations of human rights, then you're using the international community to bring a neutral third party to tell the world the real truth, the narrative of what really happened, violation of human rights in the case of Nicaragua, for example.
Do you want to?
I was just going to pick on the international and breaking into small bits. I mean, we have literature from people in this room that we talk about waves of democratization, autocratization, and you got your regional blocks. I mean, when the dictator in the Gambia decided that, I don't like the results and it's going to continue a dictatorship, ECOWAS said, no, we don't do dictatorships in West Africa anymore. And now you see actually, you start getting coups when Mali starts with a coup and Burkina Faso kind of has that excuse as well. Niger goes after. So you have these kind of contagion of both democratizing forces and autocratizing forces. So I think it's interesting to look at the regional blocks, the political regional blocks, the economic blocks.
And I think we will have a chance to talk about perverse sources of international support probably in the next panel when we talk about misinformation campaigns from media to precisely have different sources of international support for authoritarian regimes instead. I wanted to bring one more tool out of the toolbox in terms of what is the role of research that research can play to advance the effectiveness and the impact of civil society organizations. And I wanted to turn back to you, Miguel, if you can reflect a little bit more of the work that you have been doing in your organization and ideas in terms of setting or using research to better understand the context in which civil society works in authoritarian contexts. Just recently, the OECD did a nice feature article on how to confront authoritarian regimes from a civil society perspective, and your work, I believe, was cited there.
How to stay engaged on the back slides. Yeah, I came prepared with 3 points on what academia can do to empower civil society, because they asked us to have questions. And one of them is that we provide a lot of, and again, this is an ideal type. Some academia does it better than others, but we provide analysis, right? It's not just data, we need data. Michael Coppedge was mentioning that we need data, but then we need to digest that. Oh, let's be hipsters. We need to curate the data, right? And that's what researchers are really good at doing. We bring in tools. We use a lot of, for instance, political economy analysis. Political scientists kind of give us typologies, which are really helpful to start categorizing that, there's 2-3 types of countries or regimes or and so on and so forth. Frameworks as well. The context. We comment that until the 60s, the number one academic that would talk to Congress was historians. Historians were the big ones until the 60s or something, and then they became economists. I'm an anthropologist. No one really listens to anthropologists, sadly. But it's our fault. We start saying the world is complex. No one wants to hear. They know that already. But we bring that. We contextualize things. We bring case comparisons. We bring the history of it, which is very useful for to help strategize civil society actors. Well, you are also civil society actors. We do 2 other things. We ask questions. That's what we train our students to do, to ask really good questions. We train thinkers, right? Academia, it's also that job of teaching. And we keep on saying, how do you deal with misinformation? It's critical thinking, which is easier to say than do, but training critical thinking skills. That's what we do at university level. It should happen when you're 16 in high school, but we pick up from there. The other thing I was thinking this morning is we provide refuge. In a lot of the times when you start having backslides, we provide spaces for important actors in civil society, in political parties, to come to universities, and we become a refuge. And we've noticed that in some countries more than others. But we have a problem. Steven Pinker made fun of us that we speak academies, right? And it's that. We need to simplify our language. We need to translate. We need to be quick. And we had a research program between ENAP, the Brazilian National School of Public Administration, IPEA, which is the government think tank, and us, IDS. And we were trying to look at the same problem. And ENAP was saying, well, we have a month to give an answer because the ministries are waiting for us. IPEA was saying, well, we have a year. And they made fun of me. You're academia. You got like 3 or 5 years to get to that answer. And if we want to help other civil society actors and governments as well, we need to be quick. And there are space. We can help through think tanks. We can feed. More and more we do help desks and literature reviews and things like that. And I think that those are the spaces we can do. So I'll give the example that we did. So we got commissioned to do a backstopping for the Swiss Development Corporation on a lot of themes around governance. And they wanted to find out, well, how do you stay engaged when you have democratic backslides? So the first thing we do is we review the literature, right? So we start reading, the Perez Lignan and Manwaring and Coppedge and Guillermo O'Donnell's and other people outside Notre Dame as well. They do it
mostly.
And we start telling, well, this is what the literature says. And then we start mapping out, actually we got the kind of from the basics of Dahl on what a democracy, you've got the 2 components, right? Which is contestation and political liberalization. And we started using the typology that Guillermo O'Donnell and Philippe Schmidt used to talk about democratic transitions to start mapping out the countries using VDEM data. So there's all this data there, right? But we need to digest it. And the great thing about the VDEM data is that it's longitudinal. It's there since the 1900s. So we could start mapping paths of how countries democratize, autocratize, go back and forth. And from there, we could see, well, there's 5 patterns or 5 types of backsliding, of which 3 are the main ones. One, which is more kind of horizontal backsliding of the horizontal accountability, so to speak. The other one is this vertical one, where you have like Turkey, India, or quick coups like Myanmar. And then you get some of them which are an inverted L, where things are backsliding and people are letting it happen until suddenly it hits the political liberalization, it hits the rights and civil rights. So I think Nicaragua was one of those cases where we started interviewing staff that was working there when it happened, when the drop happened, and they were saying that. We could see, but we were thinking, give them time. It's a new government, and it's this moment where it drops. And so us going back to the Swiss Development Corporation, saying, well, these are the three types, main ones that we find. And under each type of backslide, these are the actions that civil society has taken, that donors have taken, so that they can pick from there and use it in other countries as well.
So that is one of the key questions that brings us together at this conference. How can we make sure that the brilliant minds and the brilliant activists, amongst others, the bureaucrats, the people in the judiciary, can actually act together when this starts happening? I love the results that we can see over there. I want to speak with the 11 who said that, yes, academia can move fast enough. Do we have time to open? Yeah. Reactions to this. What can we do to really make the connections more effective, faster, useful?
Okay, so I wanted to respond to the other question, the previous one, but I'm going to try to link it to this one, which, because we've been talking about the way civil society and political society or politics as if they're separate. But one of the things from my research in Brazil was that there's actually a lot of back and forth. The most effective leaders are the ones who have a foot in both worlds. They've been in politics and they've been active in a civil society group or a faith-based organization or humanitarian aid. And it's these particular people who understand the logics of what it takes to win an election, but who also understand the logic of humanitarian aid or understand the logic of working within the state, who can become the brokers and the leaders to develop strategy, to actually weave together. So I saw this in Brazil in the 1980s and 90s. It was the youth leaders who had multiple affiliations who could do that kind of pulling these disparate cats together. So, to link it to this question, given the fact that lots of people are shifting jobs at the particular moment, and there's this kind of this revolving door between academia, politics, civil society. This then can become the opportunity for this kind of brokerage. People who understand the logic, the multiple logic of academia, the logic of political parties working within the state and civil society to have, create new forms of dialogue together. So drawing on multiple affiliations can become a way that both in research as well as in the world of practice that perhaps we can solve some of these dilemmas.
So this is an invitation to all of you to change and to move to another sector for a while and then come back. Aidan.
There's another one there.
Oh.
We call you respondents, which is, it is true. It's how do we know our stuff besides reviewing the literature is by interviewing you, is by engaging with you, and that's how we know things.
We have a microphone in the back.
Sorry.
Hi, thank you. Rebecca Shute. I'm the Executive Director of Citizens for Global Solutions and the convener of the Washington Working Group for the ICC. And I'd like to be very, very concrete and practical. At 2:30, the House Ways and Means Committee began sitting for markup of the tax bill. Yesterday, included in that legislation is a identical phrasing to H.R. 9495, which previously passed the House, which would grant the executive branch extraordinary power to investigate, harass, and effectively dismantle any nonprofit organization by stripping us of our tax-exempt status based on a unilateral accusation of wrongdoing. Yeah. My organization was one of 354 that signed an open letter mobilized by the ACLU. We expect this to pass the House again and to have another fight in the Senate. For academia, or indeed any sector, to mobilize quickly, it's imperative that those of us with boots on the ground feed this kind of information to you. Not everyone is probably going to have their laptop open watching the House Ways and Means Committee, as I'm currently doing. But we really invite you, as those of us who are on the front lines as civil society leaders, domestically and around the world, to join us and the research takes a while, the data takes a while, but more and more that we can weave together those narratives and that storytelling and that comparison of what is happening at home and what is happening internationally. And I've spent my entire career focused internationally, just to turn around and look at what's happening in Longworth. Thank you. And if anyone would be interested in signing the next open letter, come find me right after this.
Yes, yesterday there was a flurry of activity around that, just identifying the consequences and what was laid out in the bill. There is a hand here, another one. Aidan is already.
Just two quick practical ones inspired by the lady at the back. Number one, you can endorse, as academics, can endorse the research that civil society organizations do. And don't be used to say, we're not quite so sure. And the second thing is also, it's not bad to give your preliminary findings and also not be so nervous about the particular veracity of methodology and findings, etc., which can take years. But if you have some preliminary findings that support some of the issues at hand, please feel free to broadcast. It helps us legitimize the work that we're doing as civil society organizations.
Blogs in the back. Even blogs, yeah.
Blogs or podcasts or different ways of discussing what you're finding.
In the back we have.
Hi, my name is Laura Deep. I work with Washington Office on Latin America, a nonprofit. I think this is a good opportunity to talk about the sustainability of civil society. Even academia won't be able to do their work and their research without the support of civil society. And I think we're in a moment in which we need to think about innovative and creative ways of finding resources for civil society to remain in countries in which there's a closure of civic space that is being facilitated by decisions like the one with USAID. So I guess you were asking about actors. What other actors do we need to involve? And I think about the role of private sector. In cases like Nicaragua and Venezuela, the private sector are playing a very complicated role where they're being also co-opted by the government. So how do we engage new actors and knock on new doors and think creatively about different coalitions or ways to organize, to find resources for people that require salaries in order to do the work that they do on the ground?
There are more hands, and you didn't.
Bob Berg, the Stimson Center. In the demonstrations that took place nationally some weeks ago, maybe 2 or 3 million people were involved in the United States. My guess is that 90% of them were not affiliated with any group. And they were attracted by a level of abstraction that said, hands off. The next biggest group, I think, were those that came to congressional town halls to see an empty chair and to celebrate that. So I'm just wondering what the experiences are to give people a sense of belonging at an abstract level that can then be applied to so many other particulars that we now face.
Okay. We have time for one last question. Right.
So my name is Jimmy Flanagan. I'm from Austin, Texas. I'm with the Resist Trump folks and trying to do civil resistance. But I am one of those people that crossed over. I was in business and then I was on the city council in Austin for 4 years through the pandemic. And I have an example, right? That's what we're doing. So when I was on city council, that was the height of Black Lives Matter and police reform efforts. And I was chairing the council's public safety committee, which was on some levels fairly awkward. I represented the most conservative corner of the city, although I am openly gay and was the first to serve on city council. We were inundated with misinterpretation of academic papers. And there were pro-police civic groups who were sending us all their analysis that had citations. And I will say, to their credit and their detriment, the citations linked to the original papers. So I read them. And they all, in the abstract, it would say, more cops led to less crime. And then you would read a paper and it would say, there was less crime in every city, regardless if they hired more cops. And then you would read down to the bottom and they would all cite the same study from 1964 that said it's a community's belief that criminals are caught that reduces crime, regardless of what your police force is even doing. And I was able to compile that information and share it with my colleagues and share it with the mayor. And when I was on council, we were the only city in America to reject a police union contract and reform how we fund public safety. We cut the police budget by reallocating to other leadership by almost a third. We're the only city in America to do that. Then the police union got me unelected, and the new council came in, raised the police budget up, and the state of Texas, which very much sounds like Hungary, as I hear it described here, 30 years of GOP capture, preempted cities' abilities to cut police budgets at all. But to your point about the role of academics, it's not that you have to be fast to create new studies. The electeds don't know anything that you're doing. And you have an opportunity to build relationships with these electeds up front, particularly at the local level where they're poorly resourced and easily manipulated, but from both sides. So there really is power in academia to move quickly, more on the kind of what research already exists, less so having to create new research fast.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for the charge and raising the bar in terms of what the work is ahead. We have 2 minutes for a quick round of reactions from this panel.
From this fantastic panel.
Yes, from this fantastic panel. The action-driven panel.
Like an overall summary or?
30 seconds.
Yeah, 2 elements.
Your main message.
All right. 2 elements that I think have been mentioned that are important. One is that autocrats work on fear. Their strategy is based on generating fear on people. I don't have an action to solve that problem because everyone owns its own fear, but it's something that we have to handle. The other thing is skepticism against politicians. That is not only shared by the general community, but also by the civil society. So that element of building bridges between civil society organizations and political parties, political organizations should be strengthened because there are different elements that both groups can work together and raise the issue of this movement from civil society to politicians. That's very important. However, and I'm a politician that comes from the civil society, however, that's important for eliminating or reducing the skepticism, but at the same time, the state of mind, the political mind, is different from the mind of the civil society organization type of person, and that's extremely important. I've seen lots of politicians that have maintained their mentality of civil society and feel politics to be extremely uncomfortable. And so that's an element that has to be taken into account and reduce the level of mistrust against politicians from on both sides, politicians to the civil society and civil society towards politicians, because at the end of the day, we are in the same boat towards democratic strengthening.
Thank you, Juan. John, final comments?
I think we spent a lot of time debating the role of these various actors and so on. And I guess one obvious way to put it is, each part is important and plays a critical role and so on. One thing that I want to say about public mobilization or public protests in general is that it's, I think, to my understanding, to my knowledge, the only avenue through which the nature of the public discourse completely changes and can be completely flipped. In India, again, with the early years of the Modi government, there was a lot of conversation on, whose nationalism is stronger than the other person, who's a bigger, patriot, and so on and so forth. Whereas what some of these protests did, what Qureshi sir was saying, was that it changed the dialogue from being, pro-nationalism or competing nationalism to a constitutional argument. Who's a better defender of democracy? Who's a better defender of the constitution? So on. That only happened because of the public mobilization. So now all of a sudden, you have these women sitting here and protesting, making the conversation about constitutionalism. That's been taken forward by the media. That's been taken forward by the politicians. Now suddenly everyone on the the pro-democracy side is making this a pro-constitution argument. And that wouldn't have happened without, I think, some of these mobilizations. So to change that kind of tenor of the conversation or what the conversation is about, I think requires large-scale public mobilization.
Great.
Maybe on research, I think, we started this conversations yesterday with wondering why the authoritarian tendencies are becoming more and more popular. And I think, and why democracy is in decline, why, it's this year that we have less democracies in the world than autocracies. And I think we do not know the answer. I mean, and this is something I would like to get from the academia, this kind of insight to why people are now more in favor of autocracies. Because the answers that Tom Carter gave, I don't think it's valid. He was saying that there was 100 countries that were suddenly discovering that they can have democracy, and basically said that they were not prepared for democracy because they didn't have institutions, they didn't have society, etc. I think it's not an excuse. In Poland, we got authoritarian regime 25 years after the transformation, when we had very, I would say, solid institutions, but as solid as you can have. But even here, you can overthrow them overnight, as it turns out, in the country that has such a long tradition of democracy. So I think it's not the issue. I mean, there's something that's happening with us, in our minds, and we don't know the answer. As long as we do not know the answer, we cannot react properly. We can do some things intuitively, and there is intuitively, I know that we have to create coalitions, network alliances of people like-minded, but we cannot do it in a way that we exclude those who think otherwise. So that we have to create a common place where we can exchange ideas, not to talk, into those who think like us. I think it's very comfortable. You don't want to be confronted with a different opinion. It's nice to hear that you are right, but as long as we are not doing it, I mean, democracy is going to decline because there is no center. As far as there is no center, but there are two camps that are fighting against one another, and each thinks that they are right, and only they have, this golden formula. We have a serious problem. And what I think is what is really necessary right now is really to look for these public spaces where we can meet and talk, maybe with some facilitator. We have such an experience of Nansen method. It's a Norwegian method to talk in the situations of conflict in the local community. And we have special rules that you obey. And I attended it. I spent a week being trained in with different kind of communities, and this does work. If you start to think about a person as an abstract, but you see the person that you have to see. And that's a problem, because we do not see each other in physical space as often as now online. And this is very much, I believe, eroding democracy. And because we talk about abstract things, we do not see a person. We can relate to a person even if we do not agree. But as long as we don't see it, but see some avatar posting, we do not have these human relations.
Thank you. That's an important space to create a public space. Miguel?
I'm with Eva. I'm going to finish with rainbows and unicorns as well, which is, no, it's true. I mean, one of the core things about democracy is the deliberation. And this is what's missing out more and more. It's not a debate. Pick someone you don't like and have a conversation with them, but not with the point of, I'm going to win the conversation. Mm-hmm. It's let me listen to their point, but with an open mind. I think that's the Chief Justice, the Brazilian Chief Justice yesterday, he was bringing those 3 points, like democracy is about votes and rights and reasons. And we're missing out the reasoning. And I think we need to talk to someone we don't like, but with an open mind. It's tough, especially because they might want to kill you. But I think that is a point. I mean, in some places more than others. But I think it's that reasoning, that deliberation, that whatever we're saying, yeah.
Fantastic. Helena?
No, I just, no. I want to thank these wonderful people.
Thank you.
And
Thank you,
Andres
Helena.
and all of you, thank you for engaging. Hopefully you felt this as a good experiment. Thank you.
Yes, and we'll do this again. Thank you.